Coming up on 101 West, it's a luxury we have enjoyed for centuries. The electricity to power our day-to-day lives. Ohio has long been at the forefront of natural gas production, but these resources won't be around forever. Solar and wind are two alternatives, but Ohio laws protect the gas industry while putting up barriers to renewable energy. Why? Is it time to move the needle? 101 West starts right now. Good evening and welcome to 101 West, a 30-minute news program originating out of the 21 News Studio at 101 West Boardman Street. Tonight we focus on energy. Imagine a world without it. Now, if predictions hold up, our demand will eventually exceed our supply of fossil fuels. We don't know exactly when that will happen, but it's concerning. So tonight we're asking, is it time to move the needle? Move it from a focus on oil and gas to wind and solar. Now in Ohio, this movement is proving to be a hard sell. Oil and gas drilling has been shaping Ohio's economy since 1859. And as of late, the industry has been put in the spotlight with the streaming Paramount Plus series Landman. Well, tonight's program is presented in three parts. First, a look at the oil and gas industry. Then we'll pivot to solar and wind and conclude with the legislation that's preventing Ohio from moving the needle. Here's Derek Steyer with part one.
Some would say gas and oil are our lifeline. It heats our homes and keeps the lights on. But the industry produces so much more and has a rich history in Ohio. Did you know the first oil well in North America was built in the 1800s in Ohio? Since then, it's been a pretty reliable industry, but like anything, it has its critics. Here now is a closer look at the gas and oil industry that's making our lives easier, but for how much longer? The oil and gas industry has long been a cornerstone of global development. For over a century, it's powered industries, fueled transportation, and made life as we know it possible. According to the Department of Energy, oil, natural gas, and coal provide 80% of American energy.
I would say the global economy runs on crude oil and natural gas and has for well over 100 years.
As a major economic driver, the industry employs millions, both directly and indirectly. In the U.S., it supports over 10 million jobs and contributes nearly $1.7 trillion annually to the economy. The industry's versatility is another major selling point. Beyond fuel, crude oil and natural gas provide the raw materials for thousands of products, from plastics to pharmaceuticals.
Well, everybody automatically thinks of gasoline for the car, diesel for the truck, jet fuel for the plane, but also it's asphalts and pharmaceuticals and fertilizers. And so there's about 6,000 products that are refined from both crude oil and natural gas, which sets us apart a little bit from the other various energy sources.
The state of Ohio has become an energy leader, the largest oil producer east of the Mississippi, and one of the top natural gas producers in the U.S., ranking 6th. Just 2 years ago, the Utica Shale yielded over 2.3 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and over the last decade, the state has invested more than $100 billion to build out natural gas infrastructure.
Natural gas is really the backbone of Ohio's energy grid. It really keeps the lights on, the businesses running, and the homes warm 24/7.
Despite the industry's many advantages, it also faces some significant challenges, both for people and the planet. One of the biggest concerns is the industry's environmental and public health impact. Fossil fuel combustion is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, which drives climate change. Carbon dioxide and methane, two potent greenhouse gases, are released during drilling, refining, and transportation processes. Methane leaks in particular are a growing concern because they have a global warming potential more than 25 times greater than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. Mike Chadsey with the Ohio Oil and Gas Association argues the industry is actively working to mitigate those emissions.
I, like you, breathe the same air in the valley, drink the same water. And so the old analogy about the biggest room in the world is the room for improvement. And so we don't have to be told to do that. I mean, we're protecting our families just like we're protecting yours and others. And so the reality is that that's something we are laser focused on every day because we have to be. You know, we have to get it right every single day.
To address emissions, companies are investing in advanced leak detection technologies, including drones, infrared cameras, and pipeline monitoring systems.
The industry always is focused on safety, but it doesn't mean things don't happen. And, you know, really third-party work is a bigger consequence than the industry. So an operator, you know, if they're hiring out, they have to make sure that a contractor meets the same safety standards. And that's really where the focus is.
Yet some remain skeptical, pointing to long-standing problems, particularly with waste disposal.
It just so happens that some of the most extraordinarily toxic contaminants we have on this planet, including radioactive contaminants, can come up with that waste in really elevated amounts.
Justin Nobel is a journalist who's been reporting on the oil and gas industry for nearly 2 decades. But for the last 7 years, he's focused on the waste it creates. Oil and gas extraction generates enormous amounts of wastewater, over 3 billion gallons a day in the U.S. This waste, which the industry refers to as brine, often contains toxic chemicals and even radioactive materials.
About 3 billion gallons of oil field brine are brought to the surface each day. That's 1 trillion gallons a year. You took that 1 trillion gallons and put it into your standard sized oil barrel, which is about waist high, and then you stack those barrels atop one another, a year's worth of America's oil and gas wastewater, you would reach the moon and back 28 times. Now that is an exceptional waste stream. It's stunning, and the industry doesn't want it.
Nobel says efforts to treat and repurpose wastewater have been met with mixed success.
A lot of my reporting has focused on these fracking wastewater treatment facilities, which are attempting to do this really wonderful thing, treat the industry's wastewater, maybe even use it for commercial products or agriculture. It sounds great on paper, but Derek, what they've left behind is literally radioactive contaminated waste sites that have become abandoned because the industry cannot do this task. They often claim they can. The plants fail. In one instance in northern West Virginia, we found that the plant became a hangout spot for local kids, and they were literally partying in radioactive waste. That site, we took samples, the EPA took samples. It's more radioactive than 99% of the Chernobyl exclusion zone.
The oil and gas industry insists that it is committed to safe waste disposal. Currently, the majority of wastewater is managed by putting it back into the earth with injection wells.
With all of these challenges in mind, the conversation over the future of energy continues because there is one fundamental problem. Oil and gas are finite resources. We will run out. The question of when is up for debate. Some say 50 years, others say longer.
Many see renewables like wind and solar as the inevitable next step, but industry leaders are calling for a more balanced approach because even clean energy depends on fossil fuels for manufacturing, transportation, and infrastructure.
We like to use the word energy addition because, like I said, we've got 100+ years of these fuels left. And so what you do if you add in wind, solar, hydrogen, which is really on the cutting edge, continue to use nukes, continue to use coal, I think that continues to stretch out, you know, that energy supply. But at the end of the day, that chair you're sitting on is made of plastic. That plastic is made from crude oil. So we really have to find ways to stretch that resource out because we have so many demands for it, you know, now and arguably into the future as well, too.
So the future of energy is at a turning point. The oil and gas industry remains a dominant force, but with mounting concerns over climate change, waste disposal, and infrastructure challenges, the push for renewables continues to gain momentum. The question is not whether energy is changing, but how fast.
There is no one perfect energy source, which is why Ohio is in a great position because we have all of them. And when we rely and lean into each other and share technology and you have investments, that really is going to keep driving that ingenuity. And that's what's really exciting about energy. It's dynamic and it's ever changing. So I wouldn't say crossroads, but maybe just, you know, a turning point is where do we go from here in terms of all of these different energy sources?
Well, some would say two energy sources we should be leaning into are solar and wind, but Ohio doesn't seem to like that idea. The Buckeye State is known to have some of the harshest laws that actually hamper any solar and wind development. Some energy experts say it's time for the winds to shift when it comes to renewables in Ohio. Critics point out, though, solar and wind are not without their flaws. For some time now, there's been a push for renewables in the U.S. met by pushback from lawmakers and concerned citizens. The energy sector across the nation and Ohio is a pendulum that swings back and forth with the winds of Washington politics and is most certainly headed toward a transition. Renewable energies like solar and wind are the fastest growing sector, but in some cases, not the most reliable.
The wind's not blowing all the time, the sun's not shining, and it depends if there's cloud cover, and so their availability isn't 24/7, and it can't ramp up on demand. And right now there's not currently the technology to store utility grade renewable power.
Then there's the issue of potentially disrupting the peace and farmland operations to install the solar or wind farm.
If you look at a wind turbine, say it's a 100 megawatt wind turbine, it requires about 7,000 acres of land. The land between the turbines can be used for farming, but it does make noise, which is a unintended consequence, right? That might be a noise polluting, so someone might not want that on their farm. Solar farm requires about 600 to 800 acres, so the land use intensity for those two is much higher than a natural gas plant.
The Ohio Department of Health reports there have been numerous studies investigating the noise created by wind turbines, causing problems like vertigo, nausea, and inner ear problems, collectively called wind turbine syndrome. However, those studies found no link between the turbines and those conditions. A 2022 ODH report concluded any stress or anxiety prompted by the turbines was a result of a negative attitude toward those turbines to begin with. Like anything, safety is certainly a concern.
With any structure you put up, it could go up, but it also could come down. And, you know, it's unlikely we're much better at that than we were a couple decades ago, but it's not, you know, like a nuclear accident. There could be a wind turbine that falls over and causes casualties.
The turbines also pose a danger to wildlife.
Wind turbines potentially could affect migratory birds. Depending on how they're placed, and you know, that can happen. However, with fossil fuels, if they pollute lakes and streams, that can also affect wildlife. So either way, we're going to have some of that. My sense is that that's much less of a problem with wind.
These renewable energy sources are sometimes not the most aesthetically pleasing either.
When people say in rural Ohio or elsewhere, I don't want to be near a solar factory with all these solar panels. I mean, it's ugly and it just ruins everything, and it ruins our landscape. That's a reasonable concern.
On the other hand, the U.S. Energy Information Administration reports the solar industry saw record-breaking growth in 2024, adding 30 gigawatts of utility-scale solar capacity. That's the most solar capacity added to the U.S. grid ever, and could generate the same amount of power used by 6.3 million homes in a single year.
As they become more productive, is they can produce a lot more energy with fewer people.
Renewables are also much cleaner.
It doesn't pollute, it doesn't have the carbon, but it's not like it's costless in terms of, yes, it does have its own problems, but not nearly the same as fossil fuels.
Depending on where in Ohio the solar and wind farms are located will determine how much energy they'll produce.
The biggest benefit is taking advantage of resources that we have here in Ohio. So for wind, especially in Northeast Ohio, we have wind available. So it's taking advantage of what we have. A lot of areas have very good sunlight for solar. Another benefit is really the revenues.
After speaking with the experts, I traveled to Van Wert, where there are hundreds of wind turbines and solar panels in the works, But the consensus is they aren't exactly welcomed.
It's just, you'll never be able to farm their ground again. And this is where a lot of the food comes from, right here in this county.
Arlene Kieser has been farming for decades, passing the trade along to future generations. So the last thing she wants is a sea of solar panels flooding her land.
I think it'll devaluate our farm ground, I really do. Because who wants to buy a farm that's in the middle of the solar panels?
We don't know what's going to happen.
Betty Hessel, a farmer who has passed her land down to her grandchildren, wants it to remain as is. What are your concerns with solar panels on farmland? I mean, what worries you the most?
I think it's going to ruin our land. It'll never be the same. You put those solar panels on, nobody's going to pay up for your land. You can't sell it no more.
It's up there.
Van Wert County Commissioner Thad Lichtensteiger says he sees it from both sides.
And they're a great addition for the schools. They're a great revenue generator for the schools. But, you know, we're a farm community and we grow crops. And I think people, they're kind of purists. And I think they're just going to see this as kind of despoiling the countryside.
Lichtensteiger tells me about 20% of the Van Wert community is optimistic about wind turbines and solar panels, including Misty Landwehr, who lives in close proximity to the turbines, but still has some reservations.
The only concern would be if we would have a tornado or something like that. That is a huge concern sometimes when we're driving and you hear tornado warning or whatever, and we're like, oh man, if that gets a hold of that.
When it comes to the energy sector as a whole and reducing carbon emissions, Ogle believes it's an all-of-the-above approach.
Each part has a place to play. Natural gas, we believe, is very important because when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, the natural gas is able to step up. So it's not competing with renewables that a lot of people like to position it as. It's actually making them possible by filling the gaps when they're not producing power.
Still, that will mean upgrades.
What's really needed is an electrical grid that can move electricity from places where it's cloudy to where, get it from where it's sunny, or places where it's windy and move it to places where it's not windy that day. And right now our electrical grid is really clunky.
Making sure that we have modern energy storage, energy grids can help with this intermittency so that when the wind isn't blowing, we've stored up the energy from when it was blowing to then kind of control for that energy intermittency, and also to have a truly all-in approach to energy where we have wind, we have solar, we have natural gas, we have nuclear, so that we can get energy from a variety of sources, but have it on demand when we want that energy.
Ogle says our fight shouldn't be renewables versus fossil fuels.
We have an emissions issue, not a fuel issue.
And if we don't do something,
we're just going to see the types of extreme weather that we've been experiencing the past 5-10 years. We're going to see those patterns become more extreme and more frequent.
Down the line, one energy source won't suffice without the others. So what will it take to move the needle?
Natural gas has been important in reducing emissions. And so, even if you think about oil and gas, the wind turbines and the solar panels are made from derivatives of those products. So people that want to have a very simple conversation that you want to eliminate one of them aren't thinking about how ingrained it is through our life.
If the two, fossil fuels and renewable energy, are destined to be so entwined, why then are Ohio lawmakers so reluctant to embrace renewable energy? Right now, solar and wind projects make up 90% of new energy projects in this region, but only a small amount come to fruition. Ohio law protects the oil and gas industry, but puts roadblocks up against the renewable energy industry. Experts say it may be setting Ohio up for failure and not the future. Ohio has a restrictive stance on renewable energy, making it an outlier from other states. At the same time, Ohio has created a favorable environment for fossil fuels.
Ohio is ramming down the throats of its constituents the development of oil and gas resources, while on the other hand, throwing up barriers to the development of wind and solar resources.
Ohio law has long recognized the state as having the power to approve oil and gas projects with no input from local government. And yet, those same lawmakers have given local governments more power to stop renewable projects. Let's go back to 2021, when a piece of legislation revised Ohio's wind and solar laws. Senate Bill 52 gave counties the authority to ban commercial wind and solar projects. As of right now, 26 out of 88 Ohio counties have since passed resolutions to ban renewable energy developments. Columbiana County has banned major wind and solar projects in all townships, one of 8 counties in Ohio to take it that far.
Ohio is leading the nation in these local bans on wind and solar due to this legislation.
Across the country, we've had serious state-level permitting reform for renewable energy development. And in general, states have mostly gone in the direction of adopting permitting reforms that make it more difficult for local governments to block wind and solar projects. Ohio, with SB 52, went in the opposite direction, where it made it much easier for counties to block wind and solar projects.
But for oil and gas, the local government has no such power.
Ohio has basically removed from localities, both counties and municipal governments, the ability to do much of anything to prevent the development of fracking and of oil and gas exploration. And that's in pretty stark contrast to what's happened with renewable resources, where the legislation has been going in precisely the other direction.
SB 52 aligns with other measures passed in recent years that paints a picture of politically prioritizing fossil fuels and blocking clean energy. One researcher links Ohio's push for fossil fuels back to one of the most controversial energy laws in state history, House Bill 6.
That bill did a couple of things that were particularly damaging. The first is that it helped subsidize the ongoing use of coal, which resulted in Ohio ratepayers seeing their electric bills go up.
HB 6 also cut incentives for renewable energy. The bill wound up in the center of a corruption scandal. Lawmakers were involved in a $61 million bribery scheme by taking money from First Energy in exchange for getting the bill passed. In 2023, Ohio passed a law that prevented carbon reduction policies beyond what the federal government requires. Then, in 2024, a bill called Energize Ohio was enacted to boost natural gas development.
Ultimately, to encourage the consumption of natural gas and increase the region's electricity grid's reliance on natural gas, which again is damaging both, not just from an environmental perspective, but frankly, it's even more damaging from an economic perspective, because natural gas neither provides a significant number of jobs, plus it's also the source of rising utility bills in Ohio.
So at this point, are we setting ourselves up for the future or for failure when it comes to energy in Ohio?
90% of all new energy projects in the region are wind and solar related, but only a small percentage of those ever actually come to fruition.
This inevitably will leave developers pursuing projects elsewhere. O'Leary says Ohio is seen as a favorable state for wind and solar projects for its optimal land and has potential to be a clean energy exporter for the entire region.
And that's an opportunity, both an economic and an energy opportunity, that's largely being missed.
Meanwhile, other states are getting ahead, like Texas, showing a promising future in renewable energy.
A lot of people don't think of Texas as a green energy state. You know, they think of it as an oil state, but Texas has really been one of the states leading the way.
Ohio electric rates used to be about 15% lower than the rates in Texas. Today, they're nearly 20% higher than in Texas.
O'Leary says more than a quarter of the U.S. power generation comes from renewable resources. 4% of Ohio's electricity comes from renewables. In Texas, it's 34%, which has led to increased supply, economic development, and has brought down utility rates. So why does Ohio seem to be picking favorites?
Ohio has a very large natural gas industry producing natural gas that also has a vested interest in seeing the development of new natural gas power plants.
Dave Anderson is a researcher of Energy and Policy Institute, a utility and fossil fuel industry watchdog group that supports clean energy. He says it all comes down to power.
The renewable energy industry has certainly grown, but it can't match the political influence and lobbying power of the oil and gas industry, which is much more embedded and has a lot more money to spend.
Anderson says there are ties between politicians, energy corporations, and dark money groups that can raise and spend an unlimited amount of money without disclosing their donors. These funds can influence elections and public policy.
When you have regulators who are bought and paid for by either a utility or gas company, it's not good because they're going to lean toward the side of the private companies and their investors as opposed to protecting the everyday consumers that they're supposed to be there to represent.
If Ohio continues to rely on fossil fuels to meet its increasing electricity demand, then there could be serious repercussions.
First of all, just because of the lack of energy against a backdrop of even greater demand, it's going to drive prices up.
The bottom line is we will need to do something, and the longer we wait, the more expensive it'll get.
If we build a lot of new gas-fired power plants now and then decide in 5 years or 10 years that we have to do something to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere to stop global warming, it will have a huge financial and economic impact on ratepayers. If and when those resources have to be replaced or in some other way remediated, that will be horrifically expensive.
Aside from cost, O'Leary says the impacts are damaging to people's health.
We're talking about the emissions that comes particularly from gas-fired power plants. We're talking about the ground pollution and the water pollution that takes place as a result of fracking and the damage that that does to people's health. But it also has impacts on the local economy. It's not accidental that the counties in Ohio which are seeing the greatest levels of population loss are also the counties in Ohio that are seeing the greatest amount of oil and gas development. And so the only question that Ohio needs to deal with is, do we want less expensive energy that's clean, or do we want more expensive energy that's dirty? And right now, the legislature is choosing more expensive energy that's dirty.
The future source of our energy is unclear for sure. Gas and oil and solar and wind working together is already playing out in Columbiana County. Just last week, we reported on a solar project that was approved, a project that will ironically power a gas plant. Well, that concludes this edition of 101 West. If you have a story idea that you would like to see us investigate, you can email us at watchdog@wfmj.com. I'm Matt Stone. Have a good evening.